little video on some speculation and theorizing as to an ontological scale, ladder, gradient, precession, more so precession, kind of a little bit of a take on the hypostases, or the hypostatic model, or Platinian hypostatic model. And let's begin, because if I contextualize this before I go, it might get a little bit convoluted, so I'll contextualize it as I go. First, let's do a little bit of an overview, just so you can kind of see where this is gonna go. All right. Let's go back to the monad. And this will be through the lens of subject-object dynamics. Subject being not only kind of like purposely connoting like subjective experience, or like a subject as in consciousness or a subjective observer, but also trying to denote the substrata, or going under definition, substrate. That which underlies is the subject, right? So we have the monad as the non-dual objective subject. And I only say objective subject. This is almost like an irony, almost, kind of ironic, because I'm saying non-dual objective subject. But that just means that the objective nature of the subject is that it has a way that it is, and the subject is the way that it is. So, for instance, if we were to say that, like, not that this is necessarily implying what I'm about to say, but if we were to say that consciousness or some kind of subjective reality was fundamental, that there would be a way that that subjective principle is, and in that sense it is objective. But that does, just because that is the case does not mean there's actually two things, a subject and an object. It's both. It's one thing. It's an objective subject. I guess in the definition of subject that I kind of said what I was going for denotatively, this would be unnecessary, but it's really just to kind of temper the understanding of the reader in this. And then we have this kind of precession of this dot, right, in the middle of the monad, and it looks to be reverting back into itself, and all that is representing is the subject contemplating itself. And as I stipulate here, the subject's involution or precession reversion immediately constitutes a second rank of its essential being, or the second hypostasis, the self-involved subject-object dynamo. So of course, it is not really actually proceeding from its being. You can't have, if the fundamental, like, primary principle, which we're going to say the subject is primary, the monad is primary, but also absolute, there's no proceeding away from it. It's the only thing that exists. So this is just for demonstration. You have a precession away from it in the sense that it is kind of contemplating itself, and that the fundamental principle has this ability, but the activation of that ability immediately, this middle section that you see here, where it's proceeding and reverting, is essentially considered the same thing as the nous, or indefinite dyad, because we have a subject-object dynamo, or we have the subject reverting onto itself, but all that really means is it's contemplating its own objective nature. It's contemplating the way that it is, and the way that it is has this subjective, in the connotative sense that I mentioned earlier, nature to it, of kind of this consciousness, this self-consciousness, which does not need an external object of consciousness. But we are going to go ahead and say that the subject, even thinking itself, because that constitutes an activation, constitutes the second rank of its being, the nous, or indefinite dyad. However, we will say that the subject is fully involved in this, and it can be fully involved in this. The monad can be fully involved in the dyad. And, as you can see, the monad is in this diagram of the dyad. It can do this without diminution. It can do this without diminishing its own being. And the way I like to explain how that works is that you can have, take your own mind, for instance. You have a mental metastructure or substrate that can contain a number of mental conditions or states. None of these states or conditions change the mind from being a mind, and the mind is always fully involved in those conditions. And it's never not a mind. So the subject, the primary principle, can be fully involved with the entirety of reality and the entirety of its procession, so to speak, without diminution. So that's going to be an important point. That's an important point in my modeling of metaphysics, and it's an important point of this ontological diagram that I kind of just wrote up for fun. But subject-object dynamo. This is the subject thinking itself, like we said earlier, with this kind of midsection. I kind of wanted this to indicate that this midsection was the same thing as this Nous indefinite dyad rank. Contemplating its own object, rendering and pluralizing its objective nature in a mental manner akin to self-definition. In sum, the way it is partitioned in the most universal way, contained by the primary nature. So, basically what I'm saying there is that this kind of self-contemplation renders more definition to the objective nature of the subject, right? Because it's contemplating what it is, it kind of defines what it is. It doesn't change what it is, but it kind of renders some definition to what that is. And this is where we get the Henads in my speculation here. Henads, I kind of think of, well, first, let's, this is definitely speculative on my part, but I kind of thought it was fun, kind of an interesting idea, right? The Henads being the subject of the forms, the substrate, kind of the being of the forms, and the forms being the objects of the Henads, or the conditions. So if you, for instance, if your soul was defined by a condition, as opposed to, say, my soul, and that our souls were distinct according to the conditions that our souls are taking on and assuming, we're not distinct in the fundamental nature of our souls, we're distinct in the conditions that our souls are assuming, that would be, the Henads would be that on the most universal scale. So barely distinct. That's why, like, the YouTube channel Apotheite, in his group chats, good channel and good guy, he has talked about how this is why the gods and the Henads are kind of relayed in myth so intimately with one another, that is, probably contributing to kind of like the incestuousness of myth is really the self-containment of Henads in each other. So the reason why Henads kind of have this more distinct self-containment as compared to one another is because they simply are the most universal conditions. They contain the most conditional reality, so to speak. Meaning they have the least definition. Definition is basically synonymous with particularity. So the less particular, the less defined you are against something else. So we are defined enough to, for instance, have bodies that are manifested locally and like relatively, of course. So that does indicate there's still some substrate that kind of connects us. But we appear distinct nonetheless, right? So yeah, the Henads would be like the most universal souls in a way, in my opinion. I guess we could definitely get semantic with souls, and I think that's honestly necessary because I think there's unneeded convolution right now. I think there needs to be more semantic discussion Yeah. Let's not skip this. The self-objectification or thought process of the nous renders condition, and the first primary conditions are the most universal, and those would be the conditions of the Henads. So of course, the most universal conditions would be like the conditions directly following off of like the meta structure of reality, right? So these would be that's why gods are considered like so archetypal. Not that they are archetypes. I would say the forms or the objects of the Henads are, but the Henads are not, like the subjects are not archetypes in themselves. Another thing, Apotheite, I think he has an article about that. Anyways, self-objectification is, of course, thinking of the object, kind of rendering that object. So kind of the thought process. Of course, the object of the thought as a process is a thought, and that's kind of renders condition. That's what renders condition. Condition is produced by thought, and reality is, of course, mental in a very universal way. So this is a little bit more speculation, but it's fun, so whatever. Demiurge as kind of the I'm gonna consider Nous the chief Henad, which you can kind of see in the middle of this, right? And then you see it here as kind of three accounts of the same thing. Although you can kind of think of any ontological procession in monism as that, as an account of the same thing in its procession, but I don't know, just a little bit of speculation on my part. I consider the Demiurge as itself, or Demiurge in itself, and as you can see, I do have Demiurgoi and Demiurge, because I kind of equate the Demiurge to the primary world soul, and then the Demiurgoi. I think there are multiple world souls, which is why I have Demiurgoi, world souls, but I think if you're going to have plural anything, you have to have a kind of directly underlying thing that is unitary. So the Demiurge would be the world soul, and there's a little bit of, okay, so what you're probably thinking is like Nous is often considered Demiurge, because Nous is kind of the workman, it's the thinking substrate, it's that thought process, subject-object distinction. And you could definitely make that argument. It's just kind of semantic. But I think the universal soul is kind of like that anyways. So soul is kind of a triad because you have the object, you have the production, or the product of gender, really, the reproduction of the monad in the dyad because of that process. Because thinking of itself produces an image of reality, to, put that in sum. So world souls are to soul as Henads are to the monad. They are the most universal souls, the conditions of which are formed by the most universal interplays, or, these interplays would be kind of resulting in composition of condition, no composition of being. Of course, there's no privation of being. Right, because my soul in itself, what distincts my soul from yours is the condition, not that my soul, the substance of my soul is actually different from the substance of yours. Of course, when there is conditions, we have a pluralization of subjects, although it's ultimately reconciled in a unitary subject, not in the sense of totality, like in an overarching sense, but in an underlying sense, it's reconciled. Potentially in an overarching sense as well, but that would be like an accidental unity. However, I digress. Between the forms, these conditions manifest as universes or worlds, all of which are instantiations of the same meta-world. I think, who is it? It might be Proclus. Actually, it's either Proclus or Plotinus talks about how you can kind of, as well as Leibniz, come to think of it, you can kind of think of the world as there being multiple, but they're kind of different angles of the same one, which I think you could make the same argument for souls are kind of the same thing. And then here at the bottom, we have particular souls being conditioned subject-object dynamos. Of course, the Henads would kind of be like that at the same time on the most universal level, whereas, you know, our souls, for instance, are very, very particular. So this is a little bit arbitrary because the particularity of conditions that souls take on, which determines, you know, the universality that that soul is experiencing, the universality or particularity, the degree of definition it's assuming. It's not like it jumps from Henads to like humans, of course. It would be a very consistent scale of being. In order to get to our level of particularity, the thought process would have to go through each consistent, like, or self-consistent, like, layer of particularity to reach our level of particularity. And the mind can probably go further than I see no reason why we would be like the final destination in particularity and composition. I'm sure it could get more particular. Theurgy is kind of a process of universalization, kind of unconditioning in a sense. So all souls are kind of conditioned subject-object dynamos, whereas, and, you know, Plotinus, with the hypostatic model that he presents, kind of course, he acknowledges the distinction between the world soul and particular souls, and I would put, you know, they all have a similar nature, and that is being a conditioned subject-object dynamo, or really maybe a subject-object dynamo to begin with, whereas Nous would be the subject-object distinction, like the start of that. And then I guess I would probably have some potentially largely semantic disagreement with the conception of the one, but the one would, or the first principle, as far as I can tell, would be the subject or the substrate of the subject-object distinction, right? You still have to have that anyways, even if you have like an apophatic one. So souls are defined by condition, which is developed by the involutionary, that means self-involving, activity of the subject, because there's nothing else for it to involve itself in. Conditions become increasingly particular as the activity goes on. If there were any valid gradient of being, it would only be a gradient of the particularity that conditions that being assumes, right? So there's no actual privation of being. There's no externality to being or reality. So there's no, you can't have like a procession away from being in the sense that a lot of people think of emanationism, although I do not believe that Plotinus actually considered emanation. I have a video where I explain his clarification of emanationism. But yeah, you don't get an actual procession or like, there's never any distance generated between the reality principle and like the preceding principles. It's like an inward procession. It's not like an outward procession. And it's not one that creates a gradient of being. It's really one of being's own activity, wherein being, or, you know, the fundamental reality principle, the primary reality principle, is never private. I just say that there's no privation or gradation. To suggest that there is would be like, would take on just like immediate inherent contradiction. So yeah, that's basically it. Monad, indefinite dyad, Henads, Demiurge, or world souls, and then individual souls. Or you could say just the singular soul and then the plural souls, which, you know, similar to Henads and monad, similar relationship there. You may have noticed I don't have matter on this. Matter is not ontological, so it has no place on this. It's something that occurs internally to all conditions, right? So matter, in the Platinian sense, is the not principle, but the kind of the for lack of a better word, there's no arche of matter, but let's just say the principle by which matter is manifested, or material forms are manifested. It's like the mirror that registers conditions and definition as an image, and that's what reality does. So it has its place within the subject, not as a principle in itself, just like, you know, materiality doesn't have a principle in itself, just like the conditions don't have a principle in itself, but it is therein. It's not external to it, of course. It's just something that it does, which means it has no principle in itself. So matter is like the medium by which that occurs, which is not ontological, and neither is like material stuff. Stuff is also not ontological. Neither are conditions, the immaterial conditions that register themselves as images or, you know, material forms. And really the definition isn't either, even though it's kind of mapping itself off of the way reality is. Of course, there's no privation of the way reality is. There's nothing else for even non-ontological things to be. So when it comes to non-ontological stuff, you have to recognize where in an ontological principle does it reside, and why does the appearance of something come to be. And that is what matter, material, and the physical world is. It's and you could think of it like the fundamental principle of mind just has like this intrinsic ability to perceive an image of itself, and render images of itself. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you think. I think some semantics is good. Keep it constructive. If you're gonna start a semantic discussion, I don't want to like have people just talk down and like, you know, be negative about it. But yeah, let me know what you think, and we'll see you guys some other time.